A Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr. Chapter 2, Part 1. Fighting Their Way. Twice during the night, Jack roused him by trying to push himself farther under the blanket, and Chad rose to rebuild the fire. The third time, he was awakened by the subtle prescience of dawn, and his eyes opened on a flaming radiance in the east. Again, from habit, he started to spring hurriedly to his feet, and, again sharply conscious, he lay down again. There was no wood to cut, no fire to rekindle, no water to carry from the spring, no cow to milk, no corn to hoe. There was nothing to do, nothing. Morning after morning, with a day's hard toil at a man's task before him, what would he not have given when old Jim called him to have stretched his aching little legs down the folds of the thick feather bed and slipped back into the delicious rest of sleep and dreams? Now he was his own master, and with a happy sense of freedom, he brushed the dew from his face and, shifting the chunk under his head, pulled his old cap down a little more on one side and closed his eyes. But sleep would not come, and Chad had his first wonder over the perverse result of the full choice to do or not to do. At once, the first keen savor of freedom grew less sweet to his nostrils, and straightway he began to feel the first pressure of the chain of duties that was to be forged for him out of his perfect liberty, link by link, and he lay vaguely wondering. Meanwhile, the lake of dull red behind the jagged lines of rose and crimson that streaked the east began to glow and look angry. A sheen of fiery vapor shot upward and spread swiftly over the miracle of mist that had been wrought in the night. An ocean of it, and white and thick as snow dust, it filled valley, chasm, and ravine with mystery and silence, up to the dark jutting points and dark waving lines of range after range that looked like breakers, surged up by some strange new law from an undersea of foam. Motionless, it swept down the valleys, poured swift torrents through high gaps in the hills, and one long noiseless cataract over a lesser range, all silent, all motionless, like a great white sea, stilled in the fury of a storm. Morning after morning the boy had looked upon just such glory, calmly watching the mist part like the waters for the land and the day break with one phrase, "Let there be light," ever in his mind, for Chad knew his Bible. And most often in soft splendor, trailing cloud mist and yellow light leaped from crest to crest, and in the singing of birds and the shining of leaves and dew, there was light. But that morning there was a hush in the woods that Chad understood. On a sudden, a light wind scurried through the trees and showered the mist drops down. The smoke from his fire shot through the low undergrowth without rising, and the starting mist seemed to clutch with long white fingers at the treetops as though loath to leave the safe, warm earth for the upper air. A little later, he felt some great shadow behind him, and he turned his face to see black clouds marshaling on either flank of the heavens and fitting their black wings together as though the retreating forces of the night were gathering for a last sweep against the east. A sword flashed blindingly from the dome high above them, and after it came one shaking peal that might have been the command to charge. For Chad saw the black host start fiercely. Afar off, the wind was coming. The trees began to sway above him, and the level sea of mist below began to swell, and the wooded breakers seemed to pitch angrily. Challenging tongues ran quivering up the east, and the lake of red coals under them began to heave fiercely in answer. On either side the lightning leapt upward and forward, striking straight and low, sometimes as though it were ripping up the horizon to let into the conflict the host of dropping stars. Then the artillery of the thunder crashed in earnest through the shaking heavens, and the mists below pitched like smoke belched from gigantic unseen cannon. The coming sun answered with upleaping swords of fire, and as the black thunder hosts swept overhead, Chad saw, for one moment, the whole east in a writhing storm of fire. A thick darkness rose from the first crash of battle, and with the rush of wind and rain, the mighty conflict went on unseen. Chad had seen other storms at sunrise, but something happened now, and he could never recall the others nor ever forget this one. All it meant to him, young as he was then, was unrolled slowly as the years came on. More than the first great rebellion of the powers of darkness, when in the beginning the Master gave the first command that the 7 days' work of his hand should float through space, smitten with the welcoming rays of a million suns. More than the beginning thus of light, of life, more even than the first birth of a spirit in a living thing. For long afterward he knew that it meant the dawn of a new consciousness to him, the birth of a new spirit within him, and the foreshadowed pain of its slow mastery over his passion-racked body and heart. Never was there a crisis, bodily or spiritual, on the battlefield or alone under the stars, that this storm did not come back to him. And always, through all doubt, and indeed in the end, when it came to him for the last time on his bed of death, the slow and sullen dispersion of wind and rain on the mountain that morning far, far back in his memory, and the quick coming of the Sun King's victorious light over the glad hills and the trees, held out to him the promise of a final victory to the Sun King's king over the darkness of all death, and the final coming to his own brave spirit of peace and rest. So Chad, with Jack drawn close to him, lay back, awe-stricken, and with his face wet from mysterious tears, the comfort of the childish self-pity that came with every thought of himself, wandering, a lost spirit along the mountain tops, was gone like a dream, and ready in his heart was a strong new purpose to strike into the world for himself. He even took it as a good omen when he rose to find his fire quenched, the stopper of his powder horn out, and the precious black grains scattered hopelessly on the wet earth. There were barely more than 3 charges left, and something had to be done at once. First, he must get further away from old Nathan. The neighbors might search for him and find him and take him back. So he started out brisk and shivering along the ridge path with Jack bouncing before him. An hour later, he came upon a hollow tree filled with doughty wood which he could tear out with his hands, and he built a fire and broiled a little more bacon. Jack got only a bit this time and barked reproachfully for more, but Chad shook his head, and the dog started out with both eyes open to look for his own food. The sun was high enough now to make the drenched world flash like an emerald, and its warmth felt good as Chad tramped the topmost edge of Pine Mountain, where the brush was not thick, and where, indeed, he often found a path running a short way and turning into some ravine, the trail of cattle and sheep and the pathway between one little valley settlement and another. He must have made 10 miles and more by noon, for he was a sturdy walker and as tireless almost as Jack, and 10 miles is a long way in the mountains even now. So, already, Chad was far enough away to have no fear of pursuit, even if old Nathan wanted him back, which was doubtful. On the top of the next point, Jack treed a squirrel, and Chad took a rest and brought him down, shot through the head, and then and there skinned and cooked him and divided with Jack squarely. "Jack," he said as he reloaded his gun, "we can't keep this up much longer. I ain't got more than 2 more loads of powder here." And thereupon Jack leaped suddenly in the air, and turning quite around, lighted with his nose, pointed as it was before he sprang. Chad cocked the old gun and stepped forward. A low hissing whir rose a few feet to one side of the path, and very carefully the boy climbed a fallen trunk and edged his way very carefully toward the sound. And there, by a dead limb, and with his ugly head reared 3 inches above his coil of springs, was a rattlesnake. The sudden hate in the boy's face was curious. It was instinctive, primitive, deadly. He must shoot offhand now, and he looked down the long barrel shaded with tin until the sight caught on one of the beady, unblinking eyes and pulled the trigger. Jack leapt with the sound, in spite of Chad's yell of warning, which was useless, for the ball had gone true, and the poison was set loose in the black, crushed head. "Jack," said Chad, "we just got to go down now." And so they went on swiftly through the heat of the early afternoon, and it was very silent up there. Now and then a brilliant blue jay would lilt from a stunted oak with the flute-like love notes of spring, or a lonely little brown fellow would hop with a low chirp from one bush to another, as though he had been lost up there for years and had grown quite hopeless about seeing his kind again. When there was a gap in the mountains, he could hear the querulous, senseless love quarrel of flickers going on below him. Passing a deep ravine, the note of the wood thrush, that shy lyrist of the hills, might rise to him from a dense covert of maple and beech. Or, with a startling call, a red-crested cock of the woods would beat his white-striped wings from spur to spur, as though he were keeping close to the long swells of an unseen sea. Several times a pert flicker, squatting like a knot to a dead limb, or the crimson plume of a cock of the woods, as plain as a splash of blood on a wall of vivid green, tempted him to let loose his last load, but he withstood them. A little later he saw a fresh bear track near a spring below the head of a ravine. And later still he heard the faraway barking of a hound, and a deer leapt lightly into an open sunny spot and stood with uplifted hoof and pointed ears. This was too much, and the boy's gun followed his heart to his throat, but the buck sprang lightly into the brush and vanished noiselessly. End of Chapter 2, Part 1.